Suddenly the High Heaven Pavilion disciple walked out to the crowd and circled around. His expression slowly turned to one of mockery and arrogance. But the two Han men were not easily mocked and creased their forehead. "You little brat, walking around in circles has made this uncle dizzy. Do you want be the same?" The youngster just snickered. Standing in front of the two men, watching the poisoned man, he spoke, "Your face is very pale. Looks like the poison you consumed isn't so simple." "Of course it's not," he viciously responded. "If it were not, why would I be here and with my brother, instead of at the doctor's? We're here to reveal this boss Blackheart and his true colors, hoping that no one will ever come back to buy from his store again, and have to suffer as we have." This made Bossy's face pale, as he didn't know what the aim of these two men was. If it was just extorting money then he would understand, but their motives were very puzzling and unclear. Just when he was pondering, Yang Kai softly inquired, "Uncle He, did you offend anybody during this time?" Thinking hard, Bossy miserably wailed, "No one." "Then could it be that your rice shop prevented someone from earning money?" Even though Yang Kai was young, he had experienced many things. So this thought was not impossible. "This is just a humble job to survive. How could I prevent others from their income?" Staring at the ground, Yang Kai thought hard, but was still confused. Then, the High Heaven Pavilion disciple sneered and asked the two men a question. They shouted out, "Look, trickery!" While shouting, the man resorted to a trick, to open the black heart of the poisonous apple. This surprised the people around, for the morning had been quite sluggish. The Han man was wildly hopping about, while his fists were clenched. Jumping, he went to expose the poisonous truth. Moving like this, his once pale face became flushed and rosy. This caused the crowd to gasp. Clearly they were shocked over this sudden change. "Poisoned." Looking at the two Han men, he sarcastically said, "Such skill. I respect them, respect." The two men couldn't help but pale. Not only did the fallen man not turn white, he also looked like he wasn't poisoned. The surrounding people also started to boo. They weren't stupid, how could they not be able to understand the situation? They didn't know what motives these men had, but to slander Bossy's rice stand was shameful. Luckily, that High Heaven Pavilion disciple had uncovered the truth. More and more people had started to despise the men and started to praise that young man. This young man was naturally easy to like, and with this incident, his reputation skyrocketed. Meanwhile, Yang Kai was secretly confirming his suspicions that they were all acting. They were acting out the play of the honorable knight, uncovering foul play and protecting the weak, in order to gain reputation. If he hadn't seen them together earlier in the alley, he was afraid he would have also believed them. The two Han men could no longer keep up the accusations. Staring fiercely at the young man, they asked, "Brat, who are you to interfere in my brother's issues?" Gracefully he turned around and arrogantly replied, "I am High Heaven Pavilion Sumyu." Hearing those words, one of the men became afraid. "No wonder, you are a High Heaven Pavilion disciple. A dragon is within here. Today, we two brothers admit defeat. If fate allows it, I hope we will meet again." This sentence felt like it was planned beforehand, making Yang Kai laugh. Sumyu just laughed coldly, "Leave safely, for I won't escort you." With the situation like this, and if it were indeed no accident like Yang Kai suspected, then the two men would leave and Sumyu would then seek out the audience's praise, especially Bossy's. But Yang Kai didn't want Bossy to be fooled. Before those two men left, he quickly said, "You can't let them go, they are too despicable. Today's victim was his rice stand, but if we don't teach them a lesson, they may target Liu Shi's clothes shop or Zhang Shi's grocery." Most of the crowd, who heard this, couldn't help but notice that what he said was correct. How could they let these despicable villains leave so easily? If they let them go today, then tomorrow they might target another shop and leave them destroyed. If it came to that, then they may not be as lucky as Bossy. Thinking of this, the people started to block off the path in front of the two Han men. From his position, Yang Kai could clearly see the panic in Sumyu's eyes. This in turn, led Sumyu to source of the voice, to Yang Kai. While the two men exchanged glances and quickly readjusted their expressions. Chuckling, Yang Kai added, "Fellow disciple, there is a saying that goes, good people follow through to the end. Just like how Buddha went to the west, why don't you and I both arrest these two criminals?" Seeing Yang Kai's thin and fragile physique, Su-mu couldn't help but burst out in annoyance. "Who's your fellow disciple?" Yang Kai replied, "I am also a High Heaven Pavilion disciple. I entered the main gate 3 years ago." This made Su-mu speechless, for he really was a fellow disciple. Now, without further ado, Yang Kai came forward and said, "Throughout the land, it is important to be reasonable, while one must also be chivalrous. So fellow brother, you must not let only me take the benefit. Let both of us arrest these 2 cowardly men and help Boss He claim justice, while also helping Black Plum Village." With this statement, the surrounding people began to applaud. This filled Su-mu with anxiety, for he felt as if he was dragged upon a pirate's ship by this unknown brother. Even he wanted to escape, he couldn't. Those 2 men were also glancing continuously at Su-mu looking for guidance, help, assistance. Looking at them, Su-mu couldn't do anything for them. "Brother, let's go." Pulling on Su-mu's shoulder, Yang Kai rushed over. Su-mu was in tears, wondering where did this brother come from. But it had already come to this point, so Su-mu could only charge over. While he was preparing to capture them, he was also signaling for them to look for an opportunity to escape. The 2 men nodded, but Yang Kai saw the exchange and guessed what they were doing. He was worried that Boss He would be tricked, so he took extra precaution and shouted, "Friends, fellow owners, don't just watch. Come help us 2 brothers." Hearing this, Boss He also went to help. The rice stand's youngsters joined in, their hands carrying empty rag bags. Boss He, who was previously abused by these 2 men, so naturally they would want revenge. Seeing that Boss He had acted, the crowd couldn't just watch and they all flocked towards the 2 men to capture them. Previously the 2 men weren't worried, but as they saw this scene, their faces paled. So they quickly yelled, "Don't hit the face." While protecting their face, they curled up on the ground. Bam, bang, boom, bang, the sound of the beating rang out. Even though the businesses on this street were run by ordinary people, they currently displayed powerful fighting spirit that left others flabbergasted. These merchants more or less did anything for money and were generally detested by others. And now, when they were given a chance to release their stress, how could they be lenient? This was especially true for Boss He's rice stand's waiter. With rag bags in his hands, he relentlessly beat down the men. Furthermore, with so many people hitting these men, they couldn't identify who was hitting them. So, these people didn't have to worry about the consequences. There is strength in numbers. Yang Kai only asked for their aid, but before he could even lift a finger, he was pushed aside by these merchants. After a while, the beating gradually stopped and you could see the 2 men curled on the ground, bruised all over. The rag bag had also disappeared. Looking at the men, Su-mu's heart cried out in pain, and his legs started to cramp. For the men were beaten bloody and their faces so swollen, that even their mothers won't be able to recognize them. This situation only occurred because the men didn't have enough strength to protect themselves. Although they had swords, one could see that it was only for decoration. If they could use them, would they suffer these attacks? Though, would experts stoop so low as to perform such despicable acts? Now, even though the beating was finished, the merchants remained. The 2 Han men with their horrendous faces, and hearts full of fear weakly called out with their hands trembling, "Su." Unfortunately, Su-mu's expression changed and he loudly exclaimed, "What, Su? You want this young master here, to give you pasty bones?" Seeing this, Yang Kai smiled and proclaimed, "You 2 scumbags. I don't know how many others you have framed, but it's extremely hateful." His words were an exaggeration, but for the merchants present, this seemed like the truth. That waiter who previously held the ragbag spat, "Pooey. You trashes. You actually dare to act arrogantly at this rice stand." The waiter continued to let out his frustrations, but didn't expect Yang Kai to expand on his statement. "Correct, these types of people should really die. Fellow disciple, why don't you and I each kill one? That will teach them to break the law again, and it will also be for the greater good." Hearing this remark, the 2 people on the floor started to break out in cold sweat and were terrified. They had never expected this frail boy to be so ruthless. Su-mu just stared at him, trying to figure out whether or not he was joking. But Yang Kai's face held no sign that it was a joke. To tell the truth, although what the men did was cowardly, it wasn't serious enough to die for. Undoubtedly Yang Kai's punishment was a little too cruel. Sumyu could only ask, "Brother, isn't that a bit excessive?" Excessive? Yang Kai just shook his head. If their little lie were to succeed today, then Boss He's life would have been ruined. How would he maintain a livelihood? They've already tried to push someone so close to the edge. So, how is this excessive? You know, for every being, every action that they commit, will always have consequences. Previously, when those merchants heard Yang Kai's words, they had also thought this. But hearing his reasoning, they understood the sense behind his words and were conflicted. But the final decision wasn't up to them, so they just stood on the sidelines. But when Boss He wanted to say something, he was stopped by a look from Yang Kai. This may certainly be the case, but we can't just casually go killing people. Now Sumyu was really worried. He didn't think that this disciple in front of him was so ruthless and merciless. Originally, he had planned it out quite well. Firstly, those two men would go slander Boss He and then he would go and stop them, saving Boss He. Then, they would escape and he would receive gratitude from the boss, thus accomplishing his goal. But he hadn't thought that such a vicious disciple would appear, so easily choosing to kill them. This was far from good. Sumyu could see that the two men were pleading him to save them. Within those gazes, were signs of threats. How could Sumyu not understand their meaning? It was like being tied to the body of the grasshopper. If we are to suffer a tragic end, then you would not come out unharmed. That was what they were trying to indicate to him. At that moment, Yang Kai spoke, "Brother, there is no other method. Through my experiences, killing is a natural thing. Could it be that you haven't killed before? Or you guys already know each other, so you are unwilling to kill?" This statement made Sumyu's heart jump to his throat. Turning around to look at Yang Kai, he found a mischievous smile. "Brother, what do you mean?" With a cool face he questioned, while thinking whether or not Yang Kai saw through him. He hadn't revealed any clues, so how could he know? What he didn't know, was that Yang Kai knew of his plan purely by coincidence. If not, he would have also been fooled. Boss He was also smart. He understood the hidden meaning in Yang Kai's words and asked Sumyu, "Little brother, what tune are you singing?" Yang Kai had revealed a portion of Sumyu's true colors. How could Boss He not be able to see? Yang Kai just shook his head. He didn't point out anything in particular, but just continued to stare at Sumyu. "Brother, I think that you are a courageous person, but you are hesitating. Don't worry. I am here to accompany you and the villagers too. So what are you afraid of?" "What am I afraid of?" Sumyu laughed out loud, as if reassuring himself. He said, "What am I afraid of? Isn't it just killing a person? Who hasn't killed before?" It was like he was unwillingly to admit he hadn't killed before, in front of Yang Kai. In the end, this person's disposition shocked him. Sumyu hadn't stepped down from the challenge. Sumyu then directed a cold, ruthless intent towards the men lying on the ground. Looking into that young man's eyes, those two men knew they were finished. This round, they were used too thoroughly. "Brother, let's do it." Yang Kai continued to pour oil on the flame. Breathing deeply, Sumyu slowly nodded. Seeing this happen, the two men immediately knew their end was nigh. So how could they endure without doing anything? Jumping up, they pointed towards Sumyu and proclaimed, "Sumyu, you treacherous bastard. You asked us brothers for a favor, to slander Boss He's stand so that you could come to the rescue and become a hero. But how do you repay us? Not only are we beaten like pigs, now we have to die for your crimes. You really are trash. You liars." Hearing his scheme revealed, Sumyu was furious. HMPH. As if their injuries didn't affect them, the men just sneered and the larger man shouted out loudly, informing everybody, young or old, "Today my brother and I came out and caused trouble for you." But this was all at the command of Sumyu. He had taken fancy to Boss He's daughter, but sadly she rejected him. So he hatched a plan to obtain her. C11, kind of desperate much? Come on Sumyu, now the mech will get a chance to steal the girl. When this was revealed, something clicked inside the heads of the onlookers. Many people could not help but turn to look at Sumyu with disbelief in their eyes. Yang Kai was satisfied that he had guessed correctly. Sumyu really had an ulterior motive. Though he had thought it was something related to profit or reputation, he wouldn't have thought it was actually for his own sexual desires. He had also met the boss daughter, Even though she wasn't outrageously beautiful, she was still a work of art. An alluring body accompanied with delicate features. A slim figure, which made her easily the most beautiful girl in the entire village at the small age of 14. C11, ha ha ha. Isn't that a little young? What's more, an alluring body? Such a young girl had unfortunately caught Sumyu's eye, provoking such trouble. What utter rubbish. Sumyu's face was as red as a tomato, trying to deny the truth. Sneering, the man continued to say, I have said no lies. Even though we two brothers have our faults, and done some criminal acts, slandering Boss He and poisoning his rice, this is something we would never do. Fellow people, you should know that sabotaging others' livelihoods is equal to sabotaging my own. So how can I survive? Everything was instigated by this little brat. This statement was very sincere, causing everybody to start laughing. In a timely manner, Yang Kai asked, after this was over, how much did he promise to give? 52 silvers. The man replied. 52, that's a lot. Yang Kai softly said while nodding. During this banter, Boss He was listening carefully. This made him understand the situation thoroughly. Turning towards Sumyu, he angrily said, you despicable person. You actually dared to use such dirty methods to get my daughter. Thankfully she has eyes and saw your true face. Ah, how could High Heaven Pavilion have such a degenerate disciple? You are ruining your sect's good name. You are vain and selfish. Completely opposite to Brother Yang. I feel ashamed for your mother and father. Surrounding merchants also started to feel more contempt towards Sumyu's outrageous acts. Sumyu's face was bright red, for he knew that he could no longer come back to Black Plum Village. For his mask had been taken away and his true face had been revealed. And the source of all his misfortunes was in front of him. This disciple. If not for him, he would have been able to win the boss' favor and further his reputation. That would have made it easier to curry the daughter's love for him. But all that planning had gone to waste. Not only had he failed to gain any reputation, he had also lost reputation he had previously for being a disciple of High Heaven Pavilion. Under that situation, Sumyu put on a calm face and turned towards Yang Kai and asked, Brother, how may I call you? You guess. Yang Kai replied with a wink. Taking a deep breath, Sumyu said, though you may have chosen to withhold your identity, I will able to find out. For you have already entered the school for 3 years, yet you are not even an ordinary disciple. That means you are a trial disciple, and within the entire school, there are only a few of you. Finding you will be simple. When he finished, he immediately turned around and left. In the end, he did have some strength. For those who blocked his path, he pushed them to the side, stomping away unhindered. When he had left, the people had only just remembered the 2 Han men. But where were they? There was no trace, for when Yang Kai and Sumyu were arguing, they had sneakily ran away. The debacle had finally been resolved. Yang Kai was satisfied, for he had exposed the deceit, gained approval from the merchants, and Boss He was especially grateful to him. That waiter also looked at Yang Kai in worship. After the crowd dispersed, the boss wife also came out. Taking Yang Kai's hand, the more she looked, the more she came to like him. On the contrary, Boss He was full of worry. Virtuous nephew Yang, today you have offended Sumyu. I'm afraid that in the future, this will cause you ceaseless trouble. After this incident, Boss He started to refer to Yang Kai more intimately. Afraid? Yang Kai just smiled. The main gate has its own rules, so even if he hates me to death he can't do anything. Even so, you must be careful, nephew. If because of your involvement in this matter you were to suffer misfortune, then this uncle would worry greatly. I will be careful, he consoled. Yang Kai was immensely grateful to the couple for extending a helping hand. They even insisted he stay for dinner. Originally Yang Kai wanted to, but was scared away by the boss wife. Little Yang, where are you parents? Where do you live? Have you married already? Looking at this, clearly the boss wife wanted to become his mother-in-law. Knowing this, Yang Kai hurriedly left. When he left, he was carrying a bag of white rice, but it far surpassed the amount 20 silvers could get you. So for an entire month, Yang Kai didn't have to worry about his meals. Originally, Yang Kai was worried that Sumyu would ambush him on his way back. For as innocent as Sumyu looked, he was a sinister and treacherous snake on the inside. This was not impossible. Though, even when Yang Kai returned, Sumyu hadn't appeared. He thought about it carefully. Not attacking was the correct choice. Even though duels between disciples often resulted in death, the main gate didn't allow the needless killing of others. In short, if Sumyu had attacked on his way back to the sect, then when things leaked out, it would have resulted in his own doom too. If he wanted to deal with Yang Kai, then he would definitely come to challenge him, while making a fuss too. As for the matter of Yang Kai's identity, there is no doubt that he would be able to find it. In the High Heaven Pavilion, as long as Sumyu inquired a bit, then naturally he would find his identity. Sumyu's true strength was something that Yang Kai could not full confirm, but he most definitely was at the peak of the tempered body boundary. The only thing was, he didn't know what stage Sumyu was in. Otherwise, Yang Kai truly couldn't continue staying at High Heaven Pavilion. Knowing this, Yang Kai swiftly returned back to his hut to practice. At this hour, he was unable to practice the tempered body record, but he could practice the basic skills that the school gave. These basic skills were to establish the foundations for the tempered body, to achieve spiritual consumption beyond his own body. This was the aim. Yang Kai's previous usage of the Shaolin arts and the leg whip were all based around his foundation work. If not for this, then the skills couldn't be considered true martial arts. They would only be considered as the basic of basic skills, essential for all to learn. To the left of Yang Kai's hut, was a wooden figure. This was made, from a century-old tree, by Yang Kai to practice on. Small dents were littered over it. There were even traces of blood. These were all made through Yang Kai many days of diligent training. Assuming his position, Yang Kai started to hit the wooden man. He infused all his might into each strike, beating the wooden man relentlessly. Peng, peng rang out as he struck the wooden man. However, after a few strikes, he felt that something was amiss. It was his own fists and leg, so he clearly felt that they were stronger than before. From the strike and the sound it made, all of them were stronger and more stable, incomparable to before. And over time, his hand and the bones started to feel numb and warm. This clearly indicated that he was stimulating his meridians, increasing his atmospheric affinity. Reaching the tempered body fourth stage, gives birth to the atmospheric affinity, developing your meridians further and allowing you to sense the energy more clearly. This warm feeling was Yang Kai's meridians developing. Yang Kai practiced until the sun set, only then did he stop. Even after this period of time, not only was he not fatigued, he even felt more alive. Ever since he merged with that golden skeleton, his strength seemed to skyrocket. Walking 20 miles today didn't even tire him out. Even with the added weight of the sack of rice he did not show the slightest trace of being fatigued. It was only when he was cultivating his tempered body, that he would truly feel pressure. Thinking about that morning's practice, Yang Kai couldn't help but shudder. That pressure was like the heaven and earth were crushing him, absolutely horrifying. But with strain pressure come development. Without extreme pressure, how could you possibly advance? Only then would a person's true potential show. And only then would your strength grow, step by step, each time breaking past your limits. Though currently, even after throwing large amounts of punches and kicks out, Yang Kai has yet to feel any fatigue. He doesn't feel strained. How can he force out his potential and improve? This made things difficult and made him depressed. That skeleton also gave him extreme recovery, making the basic skills of the school useless. Did that mean that he could only practice for half an hour each day at sunrise? Daylight had around 12 full hours, and yet he could only practice for half an hour. What would he do the rest of the time? Sleep? That was obviously impossible. Yang Kai immediately rejected the idea. Urza, while getting stronger by only practicing 30 minutes each day while sleeping the rest? Lucky. While he absent-mindedly cooked, Yang Kai thought about how he should train to exhaustion. If anyone else knew of this, they would have laughed to death. Other practitioners may have wanted to take it easier, but Yang Kai wanted to push himself to the limit. In the end, he still couldn't think of any good methods. Though the main reason was Yang Kai needed elixirs to help boost his training. There were also other methods, but in the end, all of these had one thing in common: they required money. In High Heaven Pavilion, contribution points were the currency. Alas, Yang Kai was poor and only had a measly 12 points. After the rice finished cooking, he wolfed down a few bowls. Although there were no side dishes, and he could only eat plain rice, Yang Kai was very satisfied. That was the only meal in the past few days, which made him full. After dinner, he couldn't go train, so he went to take a bath. After that he lay down and went to bed. Continuing his practice, there would be no result, so he might as well try to solve that problem. Consider the solutions to hasten the work speed. After thinking for a while, he suddenly remembered the black book. One of the pages had something inside, so Yang Kai figured that the other pages would be the same. So if he had enough strength, he could unseal each page. The first page contained the golden skeleton, which was also the cause of his current predicament, while the second dealt with the methods to cultivate the tempered body with golden skeleton. However, the third page remained blank. He had already tried to decipher it, but Yang Kai concluded he wasn't strong enough yet. With the first and second pages unlocked, Yang Kai could start to study them. But after a good half day he still couldn't figure them out, until he accidentally turned to the third page and went into a trance. Yang Kai frowned as he started to read the third page. Almost instantly, countless gold words started to appear on the page and jumped into his mind. Then a small whirlpool started to appear in the center of the page. From it arose an antique incense burner. This turn of events left Yang Kai in shock, but quickly he started to rejoice. That's right. Didn't I break through into the fourth stage this morning? Last night I was still in the third stage, but today I'm in the fourth stage. So that's why I couldn't access the third page before. Although it was only one level, it had still hindered his ability to comprehend the third page. After he thought about this, Yang Kai couldn't help but feel regret. If this morning he had discovered this, then he wouldn't need to waste time now thinking about it. Calming his beating heart, Yang Kai held the incense burner and carefully inspected it. This burner wasn't large in size, and was a common item used by people. But it was half-sealed, with a lid on the mouth and a few holes. It was also antique and of outstanding quality, but it wasn't attention-grabbing at all. He took a sniff, but after noticing there was no odor, he slowly lowered it. Even after a while, Yang Kai still didn't know but could only go on the information imprinted in his mind. After a short pause, Yang Kai opened his eyes with a strange look in them. According to the information in his mind, this incense burner could aid him during training. The burner itself has no special properties, however if you were to gather herbs and burn them in it, the fragrance released would aid you during training. Different herbs were needed for different stages. Unfortunately, Yang Kai had some doubts. The plants needed to aid him at his current level were the three-leaved destruction chaos spirit flower and the dead Jedi tree grass. According to his understanding, the values of these two herbs were not high, but they were very hard to find. They also possess small amounts of toxins, inhaled over a short period of time, and these toxins will cause lasting damage to the body. These herbs were definitely available in the contribution hall, but with Old Man Meng's personality, he would definitely charge high prices for them. And with only a few points in his possession, how could he spend them like that? There was only one option left. He would have to venture into the Black Wind Mountains to look for them himself. Yang Kai had already hunted in there before, so was quite familiar with its geography and perhaps the herbs were there. With his problems currently solved, Yang Kai slowly drifted to sleep. But before he fell asleep, he checked the fourth page so as to not repeat this morning's embarrassing action. Unfortunately nothing appeared. It seemed that tempered body fourth stage was not sufficient for this page. The next morning, Yang Kai got up early. Yesterday's practice had already had such a large impact on his cultivation, so naturally he would make full use of the short time he had to cultivate. Not to mention, he was not the kind to laze about. While immersing himself in the purple eastern air gas, that slow but with the might of heaven and earth infused, tempered body record fists might gradually unfolded. While he was a stage stronger than yesterday, Yang Kai still didn't make much progress on the fist. You could only perform it 20 times and when he touched his back, tortuous pain responded. His back, hip and bones all ached, they felt like smashed beans. Inhaling a mouthful of purple gas, his bodily senses as energy became clearer. His meridians all opened up and began to expel the impurities within his body. With his daily training finished, he started his sweeping, which since absorbing the golden skeleton he had been able to complete in only 1 hour. After he finished sweeping he ran to the contribution hall. Although Yang Kai had decided to go into the mountains to find the herbs, he had no knowledge regarding herbalism. He had only heard of the three-leaved chaos spirit flower and the dead Jedi tree grass, and didn't know what they looked like. Most of his preparatory work for his journey into the Black Wind Mountain was done. To avoid an embarrassing situation, Yang Kai hurried to the contribution hall to write down the herb's appearance. Originally he had planned to ask Treasurer Meng to teach him. He hadn't expected Treasurer Meng to give him a book on herbs instead. Looking at the book, Yang Kai found that it had an introduction to herbs and their medical properties, habitats and illustrations. Though it would create a feeling of disappointment in those who read it, as it merely contained information on ordinary grade herbs and nothing on the herbs of a higher grade, but it was quite suitable for Yang Kai's current needs. Just as cultivation level had different ranks, so too were herbs, weapons and medicinal pellets. They were divided into ordinary grade, earth grade, heaven grade, mystery grade, spirit grade and saint grade. And each grades were then divided into 3 levels, lower, middle and peak level. Luckily the herbs that Yang Kai needed were both ordinary grade, lower class herbs, so they were in the book. And since they were such a low grade, their value wasn't high. After he left the contribution hall, Yang Kai went to the General Affairs office. After all, he was still a sweeper of High Heaven Pavilion, and this roundabout journey to Black Wind Mountain would take more than a day. So he had to ask to be excused from his work. The General Affairs office didn't make things difficult for him. They gave Yang Kai 3 days of leave. With his obligations taken care of, he set off. Black Wind Mountain was only 20 miles away from High Heaven Pavilion by foot. Since it wasn't that far, Yang Kai frequently went there to hunt for his meals, making him quite familiar with the terrain. In this mountain was a vast and diverse range of herbs. But since it was his first time collecting herbs, Yang Kai made sure to be fully prepared. Carrying his water, food supplies, a shovel and a bag, he hit the road. Rushing over, Yang Kai came to Black Wind Mountain and surveyed the area. The mountain was like a prehistoric monster, lying down between the heavens and the earth. Imposing, with no end in sight, the mountain with its lush forests, jagged edges proudly stood against the horizon. Standing there, Yang Kai felt a cool breeze blow through his hair. Within Black Wind Mountain lived many ferocious beasts. Some high-leveled ferocious beasts could even make martial practitioners flee with no chance of victory. So generally when people ventured into the mountain, they wouldn't go too deep. The first 30 or so miles were classified as the safe zones, while the next 10 miles were the dangerous zone. And the area beyond that was a life-threatening zone. Basically, the deeper you went, the more dangerous it was. Since Yang Kai was only looking for ordinary grade lower-level herbs, he didn't need to venture too far in. So naturally, he didn't have to worry about his safety, as he would only be searching within the safe zone. Currently it was still in the early hours of the morning, and Yang Kai was trying to recall whether or not he had stumbled upon those herbs in his previous trips to the mountain. But it didn't matter whether he had or not, as he was prepared this time to find them equipped with the knowledge from the book. Thinking back, Yang Kai remembered that there were many potential places for herbs to grow in. In his current situation, he didn't even know the locations of the herbs he wanted to find. But filled with anticipation, Yang Kai followed the familiar track into Black Wind Mountain. After half an hour, Yang Kai spotted his first harvest hidden within the thicket next to the track. He was a bunch of Li Kai sharp teeth herbs. Harvesting them, Yang Kai put them into his bag and continued his search, thinking to himself this was a good start. Walking down the road, Yang Kai looked at the various vegetation scattered about, and memories of the forest came flooding back, informing him of his location. With his knowledge of the mountain, gained from hunting, he could accurately create a mental map of where he was in relation to High Heaven Pavilion, preventing him from getting lost. By evening, Yang Kai had collected 4 different types of herbs. When searching for herbs, it is naturally very hard, not to mention that many people like to come here to collect herbs, making it even harder to find them. Although Yang Kai only found 4 herbs, he was still pretty satisfied. Unfortunately, Yang Kai didn't need these 4 herbs. To make matters worse, their grades were only at ordinary grade, lower level 2. Nevertheless, if he were to take them back, he could exchange them for contribution points, so they were of some value. At this time the sun had already started to set. With much haste, Yang Kai finally arrived at an area which was suitable for the growth of many herbs. This area was very strange. For all its bountiful vegetation, it was devoid of any living presence. especially for an area of 30 feet around the area of herbs. The land was completely dead and nothing grew, not even weeds. Though at the center of this wasteland, there were 3 bunches of grass. They fluttered in the wind. Yang Kai saw that they were brown-colored, and thought that it was just necrosis. But this was just the grass' natural color. After looking at it in more detail, Yang Kai recognized them as a type of herb, and with a sigh of relief, rushed over. With a wide grin plastered on his face, he quickly dug them all up. A little while later, these 3 herbs were collected. As he held these herbs, Yang Kai took out the herbalism book that Treasurer Meng gave him earlier and checked it to see where he had seen them before. They were indeed the dead Jedi tree grass. The illustrations, growth and environment all matched up. Dead Jedi tree grass grew from dead trees, which made it quite easy to find. Basically in the mountains, any place that had dead land, you could find it growing nearby. Carefully, Yang Kai placed the grass in his bag and took out some water and food, then took out his water and food and looked for a place to eat and rest. This time when he entered the mountains, his main goal was to find the 3-leaf Chaos Spirit Flower and the dead Jedi tree grass. Now that he had found the dead Jedi tree grass, he needed to switch his focus to the 3-leaf Chaos Spirit Flower. Not only did he need to find the 3-leaf Chaos Spirit Flower, but he also needed a large quantity of it. Yang Kai decided he must double his efforts. Though right now, it was already evening and the sun had set. This was naturally an inconvenient time to search for herbs, so Yang Kai decided to find a spot to rest and continue tomorrow. Previously, when he entered the raid into the mountains, he had never stayed overnight. However, as the saying goes, even if you hadn't tasted pork, you have at least seen a pig before. On that note, he naturally knew the dangers of the mountains at night. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. But for those who are confused, it means that even if you haven't experienced some things, you should have some knowledge of them. After he found the nearest tree, Yang Kai climbed up and looked for a suitable place to sleep. After locating a place, he immediately lay down and closed his eyes. By 1:30 am, Yang Kai had yet to fall asleep, so he took out the black book and turned to page 3. With a thought, the incense burner floated out. This was also a little mystery that Yang Kai had solved about the black book. Anything that was stored inside could be called out and returned at will. It was after all a storage book, and the burner had obviously been placed in there before, so this function didn't come as a complete surprise. Our Mac isn't very bright. It's a storage book. If you could take things out, why couldn't they be put back in? How did the burner end up in it in the first place? A mystery. What Yang Kai didn't understand was that apart from the incense burner, other things could not be stored in the book. This made him wonder, was the black book a soul stone? Do soul stones normally have restrictions on what to accept and reject? After only playing with the black book for a short while, Yang Kai fell asleep. He had just spent the entire day walking around the mountain, exhausting himself to no ends. After a peaceful night, Yang Kai got up early the next morning and practiced the tempered body record for half an hour. In order to gather a good harvest, he must work very hard for the next 2 days. He also felt that he was on the brink of a breakthrough. Not only did he feel that his atmospheric sense was at the utmost limit, he also felt his body was as well. Yang Kai just needed a final push in order to break through.